Hello, I'm Dr. Shannon Spenceley, and I'm welcoming you to a lecture on advocacy for Week 11, Nursing 3135, in the spring of 2016. I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person today, but as you know from my email, it's because I'm involved in an act of political advocacy in Edmonton on the primary health care file, bringing a strong nursing voice to the evolution of primary health care in Alberta. But I am sorry I can't be with you today. So today's objectives, you can read. Just a few high points. We will talk about the concept of advocacy. We'll talk about how the history of nursing has shaped it somewhat, different levels of advocacy, different types of advocacy, and what advocacy looks like in practice. And we know that each week we frame our discussions around a question. And the Knowledge to Practice question this week is around advocacy for evidence-based practice. How can a newly graduated nurse advocate for an evidence-based practice change, and one that really needs to happen? You've probably already found yourself in positions where you have seen the need for a more evidence-informed approach to something in practice, but at the same time you may have felt unable to speak up. That's tough, isn't it? You will also remember that when we talked about Dr. Judy Boychuk-Duscher's work on the transition to practice, does that ring a bell? She talked about the theory of transition to practice with the doing, being, and knowing stages for the new graduate. Hopefully that rings a bell for you. Now it's generally in the knowing stage, the final stage of that new grad transition, where that new graduate is gaining confidence and starting to speak up and question troubling aspects of the practice environment. In the early doing stages, new nurses often feel self-doubt and believe that they're asking dumb questions and that their questions come from a place where there's a lack of knowledge. But that's actually almost never the case. It's almost never a dumb question to speak up and ask about why we do things a certain way. It's often a question, in fact, that others are wondering about and haven't asked because they've also been hesitant to speak up and admit that they don't know the answer to a question. So I know you'll still have those feelings, but try and swallow them a bit and ask your question. Guaranteed it won't be a dumb question. So what do you think the core behaviors of advocacy are? We talk about it a lot, but I don't think we define it very well. I think of speaking up, speaking out, being honest, swallowing our pride and not being afraid to look like we don't know something, challenging the status quo, and really challenging inequities and inequalities in health and healthcare. Think about the advocacy behaviors you've seen in the clinical environment by nurses. Have you seen someone speaking up or acting in a way that sought to address the vulnerabilities of another? What was the situation? What did you see? What did you hear? Have you seen someone advocating in ways that you thought were maybe less than professional? What was the response to those advocacy efforts? Have you seen someone challenge the status quo in a respectful way that invites the discussion of a different approach? What was the response then? Advocating successfully and professionally is certainly a skill that develops over time. So give yourself some time. You'll get there. And yes, what would a lecture be without a little bit of history? I'll try and keep it short and really to the point. I really would have to say that the practical origins of nursing advocacy in Canada was in the work of the Grey Nuns, so a religious order in the early 1700s. They began public health visits to the sick and the poor in what is now known as Quebec. Then in the first half of the 19th century, the Grey Nuns spread to Canada's west and north, founding most of the first hospitals and schools in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And then, of course, there's our good old Florence Nightingale. She was absolutely pivotal in the early stages of nursing advocacy. She used her connections and her relationships with wealthy politicians and bureaucrats to advance the cause of the poor, to advance the causes of improving healthcare conditions in places where she worked, like the workhouses of Old England. She pioneered the development of nursing curricula and introduced the importance of addressing the broad determinants of health. Lillian Wald, an American nurse, early in the 20th century on the Lower East Side of New York. What she saw in her everyday practice motivated her to lobby for change. She fought for health care for the poor, for housing reforms, changes to labor laws, including the abolition of child labor. By many accounts, she understood that income and education were fundamental to improving people's health. She thought if people could only see what she saw, if they knew what she knew about the squalid conditions that people endured, such conditions would surely be remedied. Was she naive? Well, maybe. But in some ways I see many of the same kinds of thoughts today. We think that if we have enough evidence to show people, to support an improvement or a change, surely it will just happen because we know that it ought to. That's also naive. Evidence, even evidence that you see and feel and hear with your own eyes, isn't enough, is it? I tell you, I get so mad when I read this quote. It's about nursing silence and unquestioning obedience. So advocacy was not always an expectation of nursing, was it? Early nursing education in North America did emphasize conformity and silence and subservience to the physician. This is Isabel Hampton Robb, a Canadian-born early leader in the development of North American nursing education. The silencing of nursing voice has a long history in nursing, doesn't it? While Nightingale expected obedience in following rules and medical protocols, her intent in her writings was to promote nurses, in fact, as being autonomous in advocating for the better conditions for patients and for better conditions for educating the profession. I'd like to believe that Nightingale would have disapproved wholeheartedly of Robb's emphasis on unquestioning obedience. Now, the Canadian Nurses Association certainly has a strong history around advocacy. The first advocacy term was first used in the nursing literature by the International Council of Nurses in 1973. And of course, you know that through CNA, we are members of the International Council of Nurses. Today, the CNA states that high-quality practice includes advocacy as an integral component of nursing practice. It's identified as both a component of ethical practice and as a philosophical principle underlying the nursing profession and helping to assure the rights and the safety of patients. Nurses are advocates both when working in collaboration with patients and other team members to achieve desired patient outcomes, and also when advocating on behalf of patients who are unable at that time to advocate for themselves. Since 1973, advocacy has been considered a major component of nursing practice, politically, socially, professionally, and academically. But I would argue that we're still kind of muddy in our thinking about advocacy. So that's why we're talking about it in this class. So it is also argued that Nightingale implicitly laid the foundation for nursing advocacy, like I mentioned earlier, and established the expectation, in fact, that nurses would advocate for their patients and use evidence to do it. She is the first example of such use of evidence. She collected absolutely meticulous statistics on the death rates for soldiers from infection in the Crimean War. She was also, though, quite aware that her statistics on death rates and how she reduced them with attention to hygiene, nutrition, and nursing attention were not enough to get her the resources she needed to make the changes that had to be made. As I said earlier, she used her connections, her relationships with wealthy patrons, bureaucrats, politicians, ministers in the British government, to improve conditions for her patients. It's important that we understand some of the theory behind advocacy and some of the different frameworks that have been advanced to help us understand advocacy in nursing. Probably the most common framework in the literature is a legalistic framework for understanding advocacy. This is a framework where clients are perceived as vulnerable, and the nurse recognizes factors in play that are detrimental to the client's goals. So the nurse advances the client's interests and protects patient rights by intervening on behalf of the client in the context of the healthcare team, particularly when the patient is not prepared to do that for themselves. Secondly, there's a values-driven approach in the literature, where the nurse is seen as the preserver of client values and autonomy in decision-making. The nurse sees vulnerability in the fact that patients really aren't prepared to fully engage in healthcare decision-making at certain times of illness and vulnerability. So nursing advocacy in this frame becomes a form of, you'd almost call it decisional counseling, where we are really working to keep people informed in order to be able to help them make their best decisions autonomously and to communicate effectively with the healthcare team. In the moralistic frame of advocacy, advocacy is seen as a moral act arising out of a recognition of shared humanity between nurse and patient. It is about creating an atmosphere conducive to supporting human needs and human rights and goes far beyond legal or legalistic advocacy. You will see this form of advocacy by nurses where in situations where people are being denied the most fundamental human rights, such as in situations of war and conflict. Then there is the social justice frame for advocacy, where there is an imperative to advocate for marginalized individuals who have inequitable access to health care, who suffer disparities in access to opportunities to be healthy. And a social justice advocate would insist on change, and usually through political action. A social justice advocate recognizes that healthcare is inherently political and situates nursing at the intersection of societal attitudes, government policies, and people's lives. Then there is the subversive advocate. That sounds interesting, doesn't it? That's advocacy under the radar, where nobody knows what it is you're up to. It's a view that the healthcare context is hostile not only to clients and patients, but also to the goals and values of nurses. And nurses feel powerless to change the situation, so they advocate for change under the radar. What are the risks to this kind of advocacy? It doesn't really solve the problem, does it? If you're solving problems under the radar, one problem at a time, and not communicating about that to others, well, the problem doesn't get solved unless you're around. It might also place the nurse at risk if the nurse is violating policy in order to conduct advocacy. So the literature is consistent in suggesting that nursing advocacy is really a good thing. The nurse seeks change for the good of the client. We know that advocacy by nurses is rooted in particular forms of knowledge that nurses possess. And I'd like to remind you for a moment about things you learned about Carper's framework on the patterns of knowing in nursing, because I think it's a bit of a useful frame for the different kinds of knowledge and the way that they're used in advocacy. I'd like to talk about ethical knowing and personal knowing first. You'll recall that ethical knowing was conceived as the moral component of nursing practice, and many discussions of advocacy in nursing are about advocacy as a moral act intended to promote good conditions for care, and also intended to promote moral justice in a frame of shared humanity. Now, in such a framework, personal knowing becomes really important as well, because you need to know who you are, what you value, and what you stand for in order to be able to engage knowledgeably in moral advocacy. So, yes, it fits well with the moral frame of advocacy that we talked about on just the last slide. Then, recall empirical knowing. This is the science and the evidence behind nursing practice. I see this as a resource for advocacy that's embedded in notions of advocacy around informing people so that they can make good decisions. You'll recall the values-driven model of advocacy in the last slide, where decisional counseling is undertaken with good information and good knowledge and good evidence in order to inform people to make good healthcare decisions on their own. And finally, aesthetic knowing. This is, you'll recall, the artful, empathetic act of nursing within individual relationships. And remember the reading you did about the little things, that the article that Weinberg wrote? Well, aesthetic knowing informs a notion of advocacy that really is what Weinberg was talking about. The little things embedded in individual relationships with people. The little things that nurses do in the context of developing personal, therapeutic relationships with patients. But we know they're not little things. And so the problem for advocacy is that that's how we frame these relationships, as ways to do the little things for patients. Weinberg called it the rhetoric of relationship, where, without meaning to, we really diminish the power and opportunity for advocacy in those relationships, advocacy for the improvement of patient care. And the way we diminish it is by talking about that relational advocacy and that relational part of nursing in soft and fluffy ways that make our advocacy invisible. So yes, nursing has been mainly thought of as a practice that lives within the private, intimate sphere of human relationships one-on-one. We do, in fact, carry around deeply held assumptions about the personal and relational nature of nursing and the resulting access that nurses have to everyday sorts of injustices that patients suffer every day in the care context. Our feelings of connectedness to individual clients and families, in fact, often cause us to feel responsible to take action immediately within a context perceived as hostile to the rights and interests of others. Often, individual level advocacy is framed in such a way that the nurse speaks up on behalf of individuals, and this can certainly be appropriate, as we'll see in the next video. For example, in instances where clients are unable to speak for themselves, think of people with cognitive decline, or people who are unconscious, like in the OR, for example, or who are sedated. So we often think of advocacy at the individual level as speaking up on behalf of others. Now, if I can't get this video to play, you'll forgive me. Oh, here we go. So just watch this video about individual level advocacy, speaking for the patient when the patient can't.
So just be careful with them, okay?
Hi, Charles.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Not too bad.
I heard you had a fall.
Yeah.
Can I help you sit on the bed here? Does it hurt anywhere?
My arms.
Can I help you with your shirt to take a look at your arms?
Yeah.
So how was your weekend?
Not bad.
Did you go up to the cabin again? Does it hurt?
Yeah, I think we did.
Just help you with this something here. Let's take a look at your arm here. Those are some pretty big bruises. See this one here. Do you remember how you fell?
I think I tripped over something.
I'm gonna help you get your shirt back on, okay? Does it hurt anywhere else?
No, just the arms.
I'm gonna leave for a minute. I'll be back shortly to help you get settled in, okay? All right.
A registered nurse in Canada has a duty to protect her patients. When abuse is suspected with a patient, it is a registered nurse's responsibility to know the law and to report it. Patients may hesitate or refuse outright to discuss the situation, from embarrassment perhaps, or fear of retaliation from the abusers.
My patient Charles didn't have the type of bruises you'd see from a fall, and his energy and attitude were different when he came back from a weekend with his son. He wasn't his usual cheerful self. We're going to set up a meeting with the family and talk about what we're seeing and what steps we can take to maintain Charles' safety and his physical, emotional, and mental health. Yes, it can be uncomfortable and a challenge to report something like this, but as a registered nurse, my first priority is my patient's safety. Sometimes a nurse can be the only one in a patient's life who knows what's going on and can help. It's what we do. Yes, it can be uncomfortable and a challenge to report something like this, but as a registered nurse, my first priority is my patient's safety. Sometimes a nurse can be the only one in a patient's life who knows what's going on and can help. It's what we do.
Now in that video, we see the nurse advocating for someone who is truly vulnerable. But when we think about advocacy this way, what assumptions are we making about power in healthcare relationships? We are assuming weakness and vulnerability of clients. Now certainly, illness itself, and illness in terms of the healthcare context, does introduce a form of vulnerability. But is it always appropriate to assume that speaking on behalf of someone is appropriate? So this video is a good reminder that sometimes this kind of advocacy is exactly what is called for. However, if the nurse always assumes an advocacy stance of speaking on behalf of the patient, can you see how that wouldn't always be appropriate? And how it could even be paternalistic? We need to think about how we engage in individual level advocacy in a non-paternalistic way. It's important to consider the beliefs and values underlying advocacy And when we don't, it's not too hard to imagine that advocacy, in fact, in some situations, could even become disempowering if we are taking away the patient's voice. So what have we learned? We have learned that thinking about the values and beliefs underlying models of advocacy is important. Also, we have learned that we have a history of knowledge in nursing that is rooted in the nurse-patient relationship at the individual level. Is that knowledge at that level enough for advocacy? How does that delimit and limit the power of our advocacy? I think that when we focus exclusively on the individual situation, we're introducing some risks. What are those risks? Well, do we risk losing sight of the need to balance the needs of one patient to the needs of many patients in our care? Do we risk losing sight of the root causes of problems, injustices, or inequities? Do we lose the opportunity to think bigger? Does our exclusive focus at the individual level create a risk that we might be pursuing short-term, one-off solutions to the individual problem being experienced when in fact the problem is more systemic in nature? It's been noted by some that the focus of most nursing advocacy at the individual level has encouraged us to remain relatively blind to the larger social, economic, and political forces that are altering the human health experience and shifting the very foundations of our practice. What are the risks of an evidence-informed practice change if we only advocated for it at the individual level, between one nurse and one patient? What benefits are lost? How do we take the practice change to a level where it benefits others? Our lens needs to be broader, and that's where professional advocacy comes in. Pamela Grace, in 2001, widened the discussion of advocacy accountabilities. She put forward a notion of professional advocacy. She talked about how the objective of nursing advocacy stems from our purpose and our promise to society to engage in practice with the intent of improving health, not only at the individual level, but at the health system and the societal level. In other words, in professional advocacy, the nurse puts on a wider lens, looks at the problem as well as the resources, the stakeholders, and the possible allies in action for change within the context. This invites a broader discourse on the dilemmas faced by all health professionals interested in advocacy for health. This way of looking at advocacy widens the professional's assessment of the obstacles to achieving health and increases the possibility that solutions can be found. Advocating one patient at a time doesn't help us work together with others to solve the bigger problem, does it? So how might you, a student or a new graduate of nursing, begin the process of lifting your gaze to search for the root causes of patient care issues? How might you seek to implement an evidence-informed change to solve a practice problem? I like to think about this in 4 steps. The first step I think about is step 1, connect. If you have seen the problem, so have others. Find those others and start a dialogue. It might be other nurses. Look for opinion leaders in the practice environment. It could be other team members. Search out allies. If you see the problem, others see the problem. Step 1, connect. Step 2, collect. And what do I mean by that? It means collect your data and your evidence. Can you measure the magnitude of the issue? What data exists? How often does it happen? How many people experience it? What have been some of the consequences? And then, what does the evidence have to say? Can you collect some evidence to bring to the dialogue that you are having with people that you've connected with? So step 1, connect. Step 2, collect. Step 3, commit. Commit and offer to be part of creating a solution that solves the problem for more than one patient or situation. Commit to sticking with it and seeing it through in collaboration with others. Step 1, connect. Step 2, collect. Step 3, commit. And finally, step 4, support. Change is often not a short or an easy road. Nurses need to support one another and others on the team to see it through. Measure your progress and share your success. Connect, collect, commit, support. There are steps in each of those that a brand new graduate can take with confidence. This lifting of our gaze to look at root causes and to look at ways to change things for more than just one patient at a time is critical to the value of the RN role. So what are the consequences to silence? This short video demonstrates some of them.
Recently, in the OR, the count was off during an abdominal aortic aneurysm. The surgeon insisted the count was correct, but I wasn't convinced. So I called my supervisor, and together we recounted everything. As I had thought, the count was, in fact, off. We then took an x-ray and discovered that the sponge had been sewn on the underside of the graft. We removed the sponge successfully and made sure the rest of the surgery was completed error-free. It was great being a patient's advocate like that.
And I'm having problems showing you that video. So I will put that video on the Moodle website for you in a short URL. It's less than a minute long, and I encourage you to watch it. It talks about how patient safety is compromised as one potential outcome of giving in to the fear of speaking up, the fear of being candid in patient care. What are other potential consequences of nursing silence? Well, there are reduced opportunities for learning, certainly poor policy, certainly a protection of status quo or even unsafe care, and there could even be the reinforcement of toxic, unproductive hierarchies in the nursing environment. As you'll see in the video that I'll post for you on Moodle, the nurse, I think, was probably a bit scared to confront a surgeon in the OR about a problem. She did ultimately, and that was the best thing she could have done for patients. So if I were there with you, I would be discussing with you the possible barriers to advocacy. What are those barriers for you? Lack of knowledge about how to advocate? Too busy? Too much to do? Too frightened? Peer pressure? Worries about looking stupid if you speak up? Political pressure? And possible risk? Risk to yourself? Risk to your reputation if you're wrong? I would suggest to you that barriers to advocacy exist everywhere. Many of them are inherent in the frantic, high-pressure context that seems to be the way things are in modern healthcare. I hope this video has given you a few tools and a few tips to open up the conversations with each other and with others in the practice environment about the importance of nursing advocacy and the possible ways that you can be an advocate for your colleagues to speak up. Next week, we'll be talking about nursing education, and we'll also have quiz 4. And I have to tell you, I'm really looking forward to seeing you in person. I hope you found this video useful. Take care.